Hello, Father Jeffrey. How are you?
Good evening. I'm doing very well. How about yourself?
I'm doing quite well. I'm very excited. I don't want to wait too much longer because we have a special guest waiting in the wings right now, Dr. Gayle Woloschak, or she goes by Gayle. She said everyone calls her Gayle, so we're going to call her Gayle for today. She's an Orthodox Christian. She's a scientist. She specializes in a lot of topics that I know virtually nothing about. So I'm very excited. So so welcome to all our viewers. You're always welcome to type anything in the chat. If there are any good questions in there, we're going to put them up on the screen and Gayle can answer them for you once and for all. But without further ado, please welcome Dr. Gayle Woloschak. Hello, Gayle.
Hi, Father. So good to be here. Good to see both of you. Looking forward.
It's very exciting. I think we recorded an interview a long time ago for my other podcast, but this is the first time you're on Enacting the Kingdom, which is exciting.
Yep, that's great.
I think we should just get right into it. So the first word of the title of this live stream is COVID. So, I think just laying out a couple of basic COVID questions, talking about maybe some of the vaccine stuff and things like that, and some of the things that I've been hearing on a popular level. So definitely on a popular level, when it comes to vaccines, I think we think of vaccines as you get a little bit of the sickness to teach your body how to deal with it, and then your body learns how to deal with it, and then you don't actually get sick if you encounter that disease in the wild, so to speak. So it's kind of a controlled environment.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly right.
Okay, so I've heard I've heard this on a popular level that these vaccines, you're actually receiving COVID, and I've heard of people who maybe are some family members who aren't receiving the vaccine want to ostracize somebody because they have had the vaccine and they think that person now has COVID. And I'm wondering, to my read, that's not quite right on what's going on there, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the COVID vaccines and then how it interacts with actual COVID stuff.
Right. So there, I won't mention the Chinese and the Sputnik vaccines because they're not so common in Canada or the US right now, but the two kind of earliest ones were the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines. Those are very unusual, actually. This is the first time that this approach has been used to make vaccines. And what we actually do is we have an RNA that we create. So DNA makes RNA, makes protein. Well, we're not putting in the DNA, we're not putting in the protein, we're putting in the RNA, which will help to fight, which will make a small little protein, which will help to fight the virus. So never do we see virus ever. We don't even see the entire protein. We see only a piece of it in those two RNA vaccines. Now, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a little bit different. It's designed around a virus, but it's designed around an adenovirus, not around the COVID virus. So this is a virus that most of us have been infected with at some time. It causes cold-like symptoms, and it's been redesigned to be able to make this very same RNA to protein construct, so that we again will mount an immune response against the so-called spike protein of the COVID virus, which will help us to fight off the virus and not get infected. So that's the whole kind of the point of those vaccines. Now, I will say that Chinese virus vaccine is different. It is actually the COVID virus itself that's been attenuated. It's not giving as much protection, but I don't think anybody in the US, except for those people who were vaccinated in China because they're maybe Chinese natives, or have received that.
Okay. I want to ask a related question. So vaccines are putting something into our body, right? And putting things into our body is it's a sacred act, right? We consume the Eucharist, right? That's one of the ways that we put things into our body. But we eat and things like that. And we even anoint with oil, right? That's something that's seeped into the body as well. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about, before I turn it to Father Jeffrey for another kind of question, if you could comment a little bit about the relationship between healthcare and getting vaccines and things and putting maybe foreign things into our body with not only physical health, but with spiritual health. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think I understand. I mean, so let me just say a couple of things. I mean, from a medical perspective, what's the very best way that we can fight disease? The best way is to actually prevent it from happening. So, for instance, it's harder to treat cancer after somebody has cancer than it is to treat them in advance and prevent them from ever getting the cancer. Well, the case in COVID is exactly the same thing. We're trying to treat before you get the infection so that you don't get the horrible disease that comes with COVID. Now, I mean, our bodies are sacred, and they should be. I mean, the church has always taught that we have our body is meant to be a kind of little church, a little sacred spot. But that also means to some extent that we have to take care of it like it is sacred. And I believe protecting ourselves from getting infections is pretty much a sacred duty for us, and protecting others from getting infections by convincing them to get vaccinated is also a sacred duty. So I see them as kind of being very, very related. In terms of the things we put into our bodies, I mean, there are lots of things we put into our bodies that shouldn't be. I mean, people go out and drink too much, or they take drugs, and that's an abuse of the body. And so it's kind of like all things, it can be used for good or bad. I believe the vaccines are being used for good because they're trying to prevent disease. I believe that eating food is done for good if we're doing it for nourishment. But if we're overeating, if we're doing it out of nervousness, if we're doing it because of problems, then it becomes bad. So that balance between right and wrong is very critical. I see the vaccines as being on the good side of that argument.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Father Jeffrey, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, let's just continue along this theme for now, because I think it's on a lot of people's minds. I mean, thankfully, in Canada, we're doing pretty well with the vaccines. I think we're now
you guys have done a great job. It's really good to hear.
Leading the G7 nations now. Over 80% have had the first, and I think about 63% have had a second. But we're still we're still well below, particularly with the very fast-moving variants and everything, below this so-called herd immunity, which raises an interesting element here, because when you talk about taking care and healthcare and so forth, we tend to sort of, I think, often have a kind of one-to-one correlation between, actions that are maybe, good for us or harmful to us, and we kind of think of that on a very individual level somehow. It's up to me if I want to eat badly and suffer the consequences, or if I want to take up smoking or live a certain lifestyle. Well, that's going to have an impact on my body and my body alone. And then you get to something like, medicine. Obviously, it works the other way. If I ingest medicine, it's working on my body. But there are, I think, layers and levels at which all of this actually isn't quite so simple and independent the way we tend to think. And I'd love to hear from you on this, because particularly when it comes to vaccines, one of the things that makes them work is not just that I take it for me, but that we all take it, or at least enough of it take it and receive it for the benefit of all, which kind of goes hand in hand with the kind of interdependence we've almost learned a little bit more about from the fact that we had a pandemic in the first place. I'm not quite so separate and individual and in kind of sovereign control of my own destiny as I maybe thought 18 months ago. In fact, we're all somehow interdependent. And doesn't science kind of offer this interesting perspective? I mean, even the fact that this body of mine is actually, I don't know what the number is, 30 trillion or something entities are being hosted by this. I am not me in the way that I think of it, I am. But actually, all of this, we're interconnected with each other, with the whole ecosystem, with all the beings on Earth. Creation is really complex and nuanced and interesting in this way. And what can we learn about the way that vaccines need to be implemented that will actually help us almost theologically understand the way that we are so utterly dependent on each other and ultimately on God?
Right. So I can answer 1,000 things from what you just said.
Yeah.
So first of all, I need to say that all people are not just human cells. We are infected with viruses, with bacteria. And in fact, if you take away some of those, we will die. So we are not just a bunch of human cells. We are made up of all kinds of cells. But it's true that herd immunity is something immunologists have talked about for a very long time. I was trained as an immunologist. And we know that for certain vaccines, we try to achieve what's called herd immunity, where one person's immune system is able to keep others from being infected. So if you have 100 people infected, it's easier to get a large population infected. If you have only one infected, it's not so easy. And like measles has been an example for years, where there are outbreaks of measles in particular populations because there's not enough herd immunity in that particular population. So now we have to go in and kind of really stress immunization in order to protect people from measles. And the thing is the same thing with COVID, only it's worse because we don't have a lot of real immunity against COVID already. We didn't have any starting out. It was a completely new virus that we'd never seen before. And we're not certain that immunity from being getting infected actually lasts as long as it does for diseases like measles and some of the others. It looks like it's a little bit more like a typical influenza type of virus where you get immune for that strain, it lasts for a little while, and then something new pops up. And so it's going to be much harder to achieve herd immunity under those circumstances. But I want to bring up another perspective that also plays into the COVID situation. In the US, we are not doing as well as Canada is. And, they always talk about how we've got like two populations, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Well, there's a second problem that has big impact. And that is, as the unvaccinated become sick, they go into the hospital, they take up hospital beds, they take up nursing care, they take up physicians. And so then when somebody gets sick from something else, now they go into the hospital and they don't get the same care. In fact, they might not even get care because the hospital is so filled with COVID patients. So it's not just immunity, it's also this kind of broad, how far can the system stretch itself in order to care for people who are ill. So I think that's another reason why we have to do it. And I would argue that within the church context, we've always believed we need to take care of others. If somebody in your family has an addiction problem, don't you go and try to help them and get them out of it? Even in church contexts, when there's somebody who's sort of in trouble because they're not doing things well or because things are falling apart in their lives, you go and you help them. That's part of our sort of Christian duty, I would argue. And so I see vaccination as fitting into that picture of helping others by making them get vaccinated, encouraging them to get vaccinated, and by ourselves getting vaccinated.
Yeah, indeed. And I really think that Orthodox in particular, we have this profound theology of interdependence, right? I mean, our whole theology of personhood is not staked on the individual, the independent, autonomous, going off and kind of achieving heroic ideals on his or her own, but rather on the fact that we are mutually responsible for one another. I only become a person because I'm in relationship. Because
I'm a person by interaction with others and by having relationship, not in other way. That's exactly right. I think that, and I think that exactly explains it.
Yeah, so we have this special responsibility. Maybe I think we often think of religion and science as being these separate realms and so forth, maybe at odds. Maybe some people come to some kind of truce between them. But here it's not just an area in which theology can learn from the science, but I think theology can kind of bolster what the science needs to do here. We can give the theological, philosophical underpinnings for precisely things like why the whole population needs as far as possible to be vaccinated, because we are precisely mutually responsible for one another. And ultimately a human being fully alive is somebody who lives in this kind of self-sacrificial love with the other. And so, we have the very theology of vaccination at our fingertips, and yet so many Orthodox are falling into this kind of trap of, you know, reading certain websites or you know, heeding, you know, certain odd right-wing Christian, you know, propaganda, which it seems entirely predicated on kind of Enlightenment views of individual human personalities, which does not square with the science. It doesn't square with our theology. It doesn't square with biology or evolution or anything.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's exactly right. And I mean, it's also, there's a kind, at least from the American perspective, there's this sort of like rugged individualism where people want to see that they are independent, that everything they do impacts only them. But in actual fact, it's not true for anything. I mean, you know, you go to drive a car, and how you drive a car impacts the car next to you. It impacts others that you're driving with. I mean, all of those are true. And I agree with you. Our theology is one that's relational. It talks about being a person and knowing other people in relationship. Without that, we're not really truly persons.
We have a question from one of our viewers named Victoria. Does the church teach us to treat our bodies well? Will it result in breeding our own immune response? The first question I can understand. The second question, I'm just a little confused. I think it might mean, I don't know if you have a clearer read, Gayle, on.
I think I have an idea about what sure. The question is. So the first one, I do believe that the church teaches us that our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and that we need to love it and respect it and care for it. And, you know, that doesn't come by neglect or by hurting others. I think the part about breeding our own immune response is about, should we create our own immune response, breed it ourselves, or should we let nature sort of do it? And I'll say that, you know, the way we do it isn't that much different than how nature does it. It's just that it kind of is a rapid speed method of what nature does. So we will, as human beings, eventually get immunity to COVID. At least some people that have immunity will survive, and they will be able to bring that on, and be able to bring on fighting the infection. The thing is, how many people will die in the process of getting there? It's huge. So a better way is if we can take advantage of what our immune response does already and sort of train it quickly to do things that are proper. And you know, I don't think that there's anything wrong with training our bodies to do what is proper, whether we're using vaccines to do it, or we're using, in some cases, you know, I mean, we take antibiotics when we get infections. I mean, one could argue that that's also sort of training our body to be able to ward off an infection and an inflammatory response. So I think that that's a kind of natural approach.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of questions pouring in, which is great. So everyone, if you're watching, leave your questions. We'll try and get to them. We have one from Father Michael Gillis. I have parishioners who believe the vaccine is the mark of the beast. How do you deal with this sort of thing pastorally?
Yeah, I don't know where they got that particular one, but I think I've heard just about every version of bad things about the vaccine. I wish I had a good answer. I think the general approach, the only one that I've seen that is successful, is not about standing up and preaching. It's not about trying to convert a large group of people. It's more about talking to people one by one by one. And a lot of times, I'm not saying this is always possible, but a lot of times you can find out what the problem is that that person has with the vaccine. What is it that they believe, or that they've heard, or that they don't accept as being truthful that's in the media, and try to figure out how to deal with it from that perspective. I've been able to convince a few people who were borderline on vaccines by sitting down and going over with them the data from the actual scientific literature. So I don't work with what it says on the websites and the media and stuff. I go to, there's a website called PubMed, which every person has access to in the world. It's called PubMed, PubMed, and it contains the scientific literature. Now, you can't read all of that, and you're not going to understand all of it, but there are parts of it that are written for lay people to understand. That scientific literature has been peer reviewed, it has been checked, people have agreed with it or disagreed with it. You'll see disagreements and fights in there about COVID and all kinds of things. That's what I try to use to convince people, rather than to try to use what you find on media websites, which often, they have semi-truths. They don't always have things that you believe. And what happens with media websites is, this is equal to that. Whereas in PubMed, everything has already been checked before it got its way there. I don't know if that helps. But that's the only thing I know. I wish I had better answers.
I mean, it's a tough one. Go ahead, Father Jeffrey.
You've hinted at some of the issues. Obviously, I mean, parishioners get their information from the mass media, from the internet, and so forth. And we have to recognize there are certain things driving those, media of communication and so forth, in terms of, obviously attracting viewership and retaining it is one of the things. So headlines sell, and clickbait and so forth. So even reputable journalists are guilty of maybe sensationalizing things, or of playing fast and loose with statistics and numbers, and making it very difficult for people to assess things like risk. The statistical risk is involved in absolutely everything we do as human beings, and I find that people have often very poor perception of what different risks might be undertaken. They're happily walking out on the street, driving cars and so forth. But yet when it comes to something like a vaccine, oh my goodness, don't you know that, certain percentage of side effects occur and things like that? Goodness me, what happens if they start reading the side effects on the medicine in their medicine cabinet and so forth? So there's that's happening. Another thing that happens in the media generally is this quest for balance, right? So if there's a story, let's just take it to something else, like climate change or whatever. Often on a panel discussion, you get, the scientist who is, arguing for there is man-made or man-caused climate change, and then for balance, they bring in somebody who offers a different perspective. And so articles or panels or discussions are carried out on this basis. It may be that there's 999,999 scientists on one side and one on the other, but they put one of each to be able to provide this so-called neutral perspective. Of course, that's not neutral at all. It doesn't reflect, as Gayle says, the literature, the preponderance of peer-reviewed research and studies and so forth. But so I think she's absolutely right. The only way to kind of address this is to invite people into the process actually of science in a way, to show that the scientific method isn't one thing. It's a self-correcting process over a long period of time, involving many, many people who get involved and criticize one another. And it's an evolving, paradigm. And I think it's a wonderful thing. It's one of the most phenomenal things we've ever created as human beings, is a process to actually correct perceptions and information and lead us to a greater and greater truth. It's a very God-given instrument, and we need to invite people into that, and not just sort of say you're wrong, I say this, or the experts say, or the authorities say, because it's not really about expertise and authority. It's about the scientific method, and about study, and about tried and tested means of getting at truth. And we need to invite people more deeply into that process somehow.
Well, and let me agree with you that risk communication is one of the hardest things. I mean, I work in radiation field, and we deal with risk communication all the time, and actually convincing people of what the risk is from a single CT scan, it is very, very hard. I mean, people believe they're going to get cancer from a single CT scan, not knowing what the risk is, but they'll go out and drive their cars, and the risk of getting killed is almost in your vehicle at any given moment is almost like 1,000-fold higher than any risk of anything else with a CT scan. I mean, even maybe more than that. It's just incredible. It's the same thing with the COVID vaccine. Somebody was pointing out to me that there were like 2 people that had this one side effect. I'm like, that's 2 out of 20 million. I mean, think about what those odds are. The aspirin you took today has far greater side effects and greater risks with it than that COVID vaccine.
We have lots of questions pouring in, so we're going to get to the next one here from Pegor. How likely are we to eradicate COVID, given that immunity from the vaccines isn't permanent nor perfect combined with new variants?
Yeah, it's not. The odds of our actually eradicating COVID per se are not good. I think it's going to be around probably for as long as humanity is. But it's going to probably become more like influenza, where you go in, you get your yearly shot, you have enough of the population that has some immunity to the old versions of the of COVID that it's not going to wipe out the population, but there will be debilitated people who didn't get their shot who will die, as happens with influenza today. That's what I would predict, and because COVID is so related to influenza, I think that makes sense. New variants are popping up. This virus right now is evolving very quickly. I think it's because it has such a fertile home in people, and now this new version, the Delta variant, which has each person makes like thousands of viruses that they spew forth from their mouth and noses and other orifices. I mean, if it gets worse, it's going to be even more contagious and much more of a difficult situation. Right now, it's not more dangerous if you get it. It's just more likely that you'll get it, but it might become more dangerous too.
Mm-hmm. Let's keep going down the questions here. We have one from D. Are there any special ethical issues with regard to the COVID vaccines that are different from other medicines? And then he comments also, behind my question is this issue of conspiracy, etc. I'm wondering why this particular medical intervention is targeted when most Orthodox wouldn't think twice about getting treatment for cancer.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the issue with vaccines in general, there are some people who are concerned because some vaccines are grown in fetal cells, and those fetal cells came from a therapeutic abortion from the 1980s in one case, in the 1960s in the other. So therefore, it's like we're feeding pro-abortion information or feeding the abortion media. I need to say a few things. First of all, neither of the RNA vaccines were made in with aborted fetal cells at all. They were tested on fetal cells because you want to make sure your vaccine's not going to kill the fetus, but they were not actually grown and weren't dependent upon growing them in fetal cells. But the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was grown in cells from an aborted fetus. Many people have an ethical issue with that. I personally think that it's an inappropriate issue. These cell lines have been around for a very long time. Not using them would actually mean that it'd be much harder for us to create vaccines. There's some vaccines we can't even make without using them and growing them in these fetal cells. And so then you have to kind of weigh the situation. Fetus was aborted in 1980s because the mother was sick with a disease. The cells are being used to cure many, many diseases, or we're going to say no vaccines are any good because they use these cells. I don't think that the weighing feature is very strong there. And actually, the Roman Catholic Church has even said that vaccines that were grown in fetal cells are okay. It's ethically appropriate to use them. But I think that's the underpinnings of some of the anti-vaccine discussion that we've seen.
I want to just add that some of this obviously applies to other vaccines as well that people haven't had trouble having, right? I mean, a lot of people who are objecting to this or calling it the mark of the beast have had their measles inoculation or whatever else over the course of their lives. Now, maybe they didn't have a choice because they were children when they first received it, but generally this hasn't been a problem until now. So what has made this one worse? Well, it's sort of been wrapped up with a whole lot of really weird apocalyptic, end times, thinking. Partly, I'm sure it has to do with the fact that, this wasn't just a vaccine that came along because there was a disease, but it accompanied societal changes and unrest and church closures. Pascha didn't get celebrated. Well, therefore, this must be something connected with the devil. And therefore, all the conspiracies have come out of the woodwork, whether it's, people controlling governments or corporations or, Bill Gates or, all the things kind of get wrapped in, into one thing. And I think people go towards these things when they are uneasy, when they're anxious. We had the same thing happen in the year 999, as the turn of the millennium happened. There was huge problems across Europe and the Western world because people were thinking the world was going to end. And I think this is a kind of perennial problem in humanity, and the church needs to get a grip on this a little bit and to address this pastorally and to kind of lower the level of anxiety somehow, because I ultimately don't think these are real scientific objections that people are making, or that they're really analyzing how vaccines are made and this one's a particular problem. I think it has to do with kind of sociological, psychological issues that people are having, and they're latching on to anything, whether it's a political conspiracy or a religious conspiracy or something, and they're uneasy about what's going on. I mean, my take on this isn't that these are some sort of horrible conspiracy. Look how quickly they've come down the pike. Clearly, somebody created this thing and already had the antidote ready to go. It's not that. What a marvelous testimony to science and to human endeavor and enterprise and collaboration it has been that we've been able to turn around in record time very, very untold, unprecedented, effective vaccines for a disease that was hurting a lot of people. I think there's a real beautiful human story to be told here and celebrated. The church should be about somehow proclaiming and presenting that in response to the kind of fear and anxiety that's being, coming up in different quarters.
Yeah, but there was a very strong anti-vaxxer movement before COVID came up. And that anti-vaxxer movement was mostly about kind of a witch hunt for what caused autism in my child, what caused epilepsy in my child. And, 5 children got vaccinated and got autism. And guess what? Those are the same odds that anybody in the regular population would get autism. But because they were vaccinated, it became an issue. And that's so there was already a big anti-vaxxer movement, and this lumped onto that with vigor. And I promise you, there are people that read every paper about this. I get 20-page examples from all kinds of websites I didn't even know existed about how vaccines are bad. So,
well, I think that leads to our next question, which is an interesting one from Tired Teller. How do we foster an environment of open discussion, a way to approach dissenting opinions on COVID? I myself have dissenting opinions and come to hear you out. To put context to this, he also writes, I want to help encourage hearing out and understanding my brothers and sisters that I disagree with.
Well, I think this dissension is, I think it's good to have discussion and open discussion, but I also think that discussion has to be based in some form of reality. So, if I pull, things out of my hat and say witches fly around in the skies of Chicago at night, I don't think that that's going to be a dissenting opinion that can have any validity in our kind of world. And so, I think that we have to base our discussions and our dissension in facts and not in fantasies. I think other than that, having discussion is always good. In fact, I strongly support creative discussion on almost any topic that we can. I find that being extremist in views is hurtful to the church and to our society as a whole.
I found that as soon as you it's important to have, when you begin any discussion, it's important to have kind of a definition of terms, right? If you're going to be talking about, I don't know, a specific topic, you should define what you mean by that topic. So you've kind of put boundary lines over the discussion. But one of the things that I think what can get out of hand very quickly in everyday conversation is once people bring in quote unquote facts, right? Facts are bullets in my experience of everyday people having conversations. As soon as if I'm having a conversation with somebody and they bring out a fact, I know that the discussion at that point is basically done. All I'm here to do is to listen and to ask questions.
Yeah, that's right.
Unless you're really, PubMed is a place where you can actually bring facts because you actually have the data to support what you're claiming. So I think if that would be one thing that I would say is if you're in a discussion and you're going to make a factual claim, you have to be able to point to why you're saying that, right? To what source and things like that. Most of us, I don't think could point to a single source for why we believe certain things, right? I think a lot of it comes from, the people around us, our mimetic desire to be like those that we that we aspire, that we look up to, and come from definitely an emotional place, and that's okay. But it's just important to recognize that in our discussions.
I think also the media has done this thing of making us believe that we can understand everything, because they work to bring things down to the bare bones and present it in such a way. But it's not always clear how much work went into that, like, one statement or that one assessment. And that kind of work, a lot of it can't be actually understood or explained very well outside of its scientific context or its other contexts. And I think that that's also a dangerous situation, is where people feel like they can read everything and understand it all with perfect accuracy, having very little background in the area. I mean, I certainly, if you tell me that I have to suddenly go into high finance and explain it, I stand no chance. You can digest it down to easy words, and I still won't understand it. Well, it's the same thing with science. We try really hard to communicate it, but we can't always communicate all the work that went into getting it to that point.
Can I just add, because I really like...
Sorry, I just want to read this comment. Fair enough, Doctor and Fathers. Thank you for this discussion. A lot of my issues are simply sociological. I'm not anti-vax. Just thought I'd put that up there.
Very good. And I wanted to continue to address that question, because I think it's a marvelous question. One of the other problems here, we've talked about the media and its presentation of things like statistics and facts and science and everything, but there has also been a politicization of science, right, which does science a disservice. And that is that, I mean, going back to Tara Teller's specific question here about, where can the discussion take place? Where can the dissension, even the different points of view, take place? Well, that's actually built into the scientific model. There is a place at the table for everything to be brought forward, and it gets tested. And if it can't be replicated and shown to be true, then it becomes like one of those things Gayle is talking about, that it's not going to be part of the ongoing conversation, because it's just demonstrably not relevant to what's under discussion here. But everything else can be questioned and challenged and queried. So that's what's happening in science. On the other hand, you have the kind of narrow-minded, or the kind of theories or conspiracies where, the vast majority of things are ignored, and really you just kind of go down a rabbit hole or down a blinkered, tunnel into only accepting certain things and not having a wide-ranging discussion. The danger becomes when, in response to that, certain politicians then latch hold of science, but use it like it's a kind of conspiracy theory itself, right? That somehow this is the way to go. And then the problem with that, of course, as science continues to evolve and understanding continues to evolve, this happened early on in the pandemic. Would masks be helpful or not, right? And there was discussion. There was genuine dissension and testing of this in the scientific community. What eventually emerged was a really strong consensus on the fact that because it's airborne, masks are going to play a major role in it. But initially you had, people on both sides. And so the problem with politicians who kind of latch hold of science at any particular moment and politicize it is that the scientific method is lost somehow. The actual working of the scientists, researchers, practitioners, experts, and so forth is kind of misinterpreted and misconstrued for the population. It becomes a political issue. And then you even get politicians saying, well, we're following the science. Well, they're not actually, because they're not being scientists as they do that. They're just using science as a propaganda tool. And I think that's a real danger here too. Let's continue to do real science. And that's where, we can be led towards better and better understanding and better health as we come out of this.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes left. Let's go to another question from the viewers. From Esther asks, my brother, who is a practicing Orthodox Christian, believes the vaccine campaign is one of government control. He's convinced. What can I say to him?
I wish I could answer and give you an answer that would work, but what I have found again is that most of the time when a person has a particular belief, like this vaccine campaign is government control, there's a reason why the person's afraid of government control. There's a reason why they're afraid that government is going to do something. And so what you need to do is to try to see if you can get at that root cause and root it out. I will say that it's hard to believe that all the governments in the world are simultaneously trying to control the entire population when most of the governments don't even talk to each other. I mean, Russia, China, and the US all have vaccines. They're all trying to get them out. And yet those governments don't, sometimes barely talk. So it has to become a universal worldwide thing rather than just, the government of Canada or the government of the US. I think that there's a way to address it maybe from a logic perspective, but usually there's something behind it. There's a reason why that person is afraid, why that issue is something that's bothered them. It might be something from the past, but maybe by working with him, carefully, slowly, you might be able to work through it.
Well, we got about 5 minutes left. And before we go on to the last little bit here, I want to encourage anyone who finds these topics interesting and finds what we're talking about interesting at 8 o'clock today. So we have 5 minutes left in the public live stream. At 8 o'clock, we're going to go for our patrons. So our patron, for me and Father Jeffrey, do half of our podcast is on Patreon, where patrons pay a monthly subscription, and then they get a whole second podcast. So I think we've been going on for a year now. So there's probably a year's worth of episodes where me and Father Jeffrey are talking about things. And so if you want to become a subscriber, you're welcome to go to patreon.com/enactingthekingdom. But before we end here, Gayle, I thought, Father Jeffrey, we probably don't have time to get to the things that you had wanted to talk about in the public episode, but maybe you can bring up, maybe as a teaser, what we'll talk about in the Patreon live stream.
Sure. As we found over the last year, COVID disrupts and displaces an awful lot of other church activities. Yep. So what can we do? It happened this evening as well. But no, I love Gayle and all her work, and I'm an avid reader of everything she does. But I'm really interested to talk to her about one of the things that we deal with a lot in our podcast, obviously, is the whole intersection of liturgy and life. And so I think science and theology, or science and faith, have an interesting relationship that sometimes is a bit strained in some people's minds. Some people have kind of come to some level of truce between them. But for me, they very much counter-inform each other, including in our liturgies and so forth. So I would love to explore the question, and hopefully we get a chance to do that in the next hour, about how some of the beautiful and enchanting work of science. So here's a bit of a thought experiment for you. I'll maybe set it up for the second half. But in say the 12th or 13th century, if you wanted to go and hear the most beautiful magical story, you would go to a great cathedral where that story was being told to you. Today, for a lot of people who aren't necessarily very religious, but where the greatest story is being told is in biology and in physics. There's some wonderful, enchanting, and mystical stories, absolutely awe-inspiring, that are coming out of science at the kind of cutting edge. I myself am a real devotee of physics and astrophysics and quantum physics and things like that. And I know, Gayle brings a lot from the biology end of things. And these are fascinating, beautiful stories. We don't liturgize with them. We go to liturgy, suddenly we're back into four elements, and the world is flat and has four pillars, and so forth. Is there a way that we can bring the beauty of science today and that beautiful magical story that's being told to us out of creation into church in a way that would really help people, and maybe even help unpack things like vaccines when they come along? Because if we really lived in a better sort of symbiotic relationship with our science, wouldn't it be a lot healthier when crises came along and so forth? So I want to talk about that, liturgy and life, and the way that science can maybe inform some of our church life.
All right. If you want to hear that discussion, you can go to patreon.com/enactingthekingdom and pick a membership level. We do, Gayle, have one more question that's leaked in right here at the end. So maybe this is how we'll end it. So at work, one of my talented associates is vaccine hesitant. What would be a good way to broach a discussion with him?
Okay, so I don't know this person. I don't know where they're coming from, and I don't know why they're vaccine hesitant. But you know the person, and you can probably think about what reasons they might have for being vaccine hesitant. I most of the examples where, you know, people are dying on their deathbeds and they want vaccines, those are not convincing people. I think the best way to do it is to talk with them and try to identify why they are vaccine hesitant, and then go after the root cause. I think almost all the time, underlying many of these things, as Father said earlier, we're coming out of a really bad time, a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety about things. I think the best way to do it is to try to figure out why they're hesitant and then talk to them about that hesitancy.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gayle. And thank you, Father Jeffrey. I'm really looking forward to the second half of our discussion. And thank you to all our viewers. And we look forward to the next time we can do a public live stream. Thank you very much.
Have a good night.
Okay. Bye, everybody.